The following is a production of Wild Idea Media.
Welcome back to The Wild Idea, the podcast where we're exploring the intersection of wild nature and human nature. Anders, are you celebrating spring yet back in our nation's capital?
Oh, hi, Bill. Yeah, we are. You know, my mom is coming for a visit.
Nice.
In a few weeks. I'll give her a shout out. This is her very last spring break. She's retiring after a very long career in education, and she's got perfect timing. I think the cherry blossoms are going to be in full bloom while she's here. That makes my job easy. I can just, show her around the place, and she's going to love it.
Does that mean spring cleaning around your house?
My house is always clean. There's no such thing as spring cleaning when you live the lifestyle I do.
I don't believe that for a second. It's that time of year here in northwest Montana where it's not quite spring, but not quite winter either. And that means our friends, the Grizzly Bears, might be coming out of the dens, some with this year's batch of cubs, which I think is going to make this episode very important. We're going to be talking to wildlife grizzly bear management specialist, specifically Tim Manley, retired from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And I think you'll find the conversation very enlightening. Hopefully you'll find it educational too, and maybe have you searching for more resources to understand things like the Endangered Species Act. Anders, yesterday I had a chance to get to go speak to the state congress of the Montana Backcountry Horsemen of America. And, I think they're facing the same questions we're all facing, like what are we going to do with the federal workforce? It seems to be, to put it mildly, in flux. But there were a lot of great ideas flying around that room about how we're going to stand up and support both the individuals that work for the agencies, but the agencies as a whole and the resources that we want to care for. But it was a great group of people to talk to.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it was fruitful. And did I hear you right? You were invited to speak? That's...
You know what they call an expert, right? It's just anybody from more than 50 miles away carrying a briefcase. So I occasionally qualify as an expert. Let's get into this important conversation. Very excited to have Tim Manley join us today. Tim retired after 37 years of working for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks as a grizzly bear biologist here in northwest Montana. His career included both research and management of grizzly bears. The research involved mostly habitat, movements, population estimation, and honestly, a lot of the times that I've had a chance to intersect with Tim, he was managing human grizzly bear conflicts that, of course, happen. And I think that's, this is one of our early episodes to talk about that. We talk about, Anders, you and I talk a lot about the wild as sort of a definition of a place, but it really isn't that, right? Because species don't know boundaries, don't know that we think of, the wild is over there, not where I live. The wild is everywhere, including right here in our backyard. And I think this is an important conversation to have.
It's such an important conversation. I'm excited about it. I mean, I think as listeners know, I work in the Southeast. The Southeast is home to an extraordinary variety of wildlife. Its climate and geography have really lent itself to harboring high levels of plants and wildlife for millions of years. But like everything else, they're under threat, right? You got human threats, you got climate change. These are all sort of jeopardizing southern species. And my colleagues do really good work on a lot of southern species. We've got red wolves and sea turtles and red knots and northern long-eared bats. So I'm really excited to see where this conversation is going to go because I think I could learn a lot.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our conversation, obviously, we'll be talking about grizzly bears because it is truly the realm of our guest. Tim, thanks for joining us. And but I'm sure what we learn about grizzly bears, we could apply to species everywhere at some level. So Tim, how about telling us a little bit more about that journey to that career that you just got to put a bow on and call retirement? How did that get started for you?
Well, hi, Bill and Anders, and thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. I'm excited to have a conversation with you. How did I get started with grizzly bears? Well, I'm from Montana originally, and I was born over in Great Falls, and our family lived in Missoula and Butte, moved around a lot because my dad was with the Forest Service, and I was always interested in wildlife. Went to school in Fort Collins, Colorado State University, graduated with a degree in wildlife biology, and then moved back up to Montana in 1981. Started working with the Forest Service, mapping grizzly bear habitat in 1982. And then in 1984, I was hired by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to work on a grizzly bear project out of Libby, Montana in the Cabinet Mountains. And I worked with Wayne Kaysworm, who was a biologist at that time over there for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We're trapping grizzly bears in the cabinets to find out if there were any left. And in 5 years, we only caught 3 grizzly bears and probably a couple hundred black bears. And then in the late 80s, that program was winding down. I ended up over at a Kalispell working on the South Fork Grizzly Bear project. And I was the habitat biologist with that project. And that was a 10-year project, or scheduled to be 10 years. And so I did most of the radio tracking. I was in charge of doing the habitat work, going in where bears had been, feeding. We go in and after they left, we do habitat plots there to look at what they were doing. In 1983, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks created a grizzly bear conflict specialist position based out of Kalispell, Montana, for Northwest Montana. And so I knew the South Fork Grizzly project was starting to wind down. And so I applied for the grizzly bear conflict specialist job. It was modeled after a position on the Rocky Mountain front over at Ashoto that Mike Madel had been doing. He was the first one in Montana hired to do grizzly bear conflict work. And then I was the second person hired out of Kalispell. And so from 93 until 2021, that was my job, was dealing with human bear conflicts in Northwest Montana. And then I retired at the end of 2021. So
squeezing a whole lot of work into a quick summary there. If I remember right, it included a cameo on a 60 Minutes segment. Is that right? If I remember seeing you on 60 Minutes one time.
Well, yeah, actually, they came up and interviewed me. We went up the North Fork to a private landowner's, interviewed me for an hour and a half, and I actually, most of it got cut and laid on the cutting room floor because they ended up following someone else that had caught a grizzly bear on a research project, even though I had 2 grizzly bears in traps that day that we could have worked with. But anyway, yeah, I've done a lot of media work over the years, taking people out in the field, and there's definitely a lot of interest in grizzly bears, that's for sure.
I've got a question. I want to know when you first decided, or how you decided to cobble together what I understand is the world's first remote sensor trail camera. And then maybe you could just tell us about the evolution of bear management from there.
Sure. In 1985, I thought there was probably a way that we could get photographs of grizzly bears without being there, because Northwest Montana is kind of known as the jungle, I guess you could say. You don't see bears very often up here. It's so thick. The vegetation's so thick. I put together basically a Radio Shack motion detector hooked up to a 35 millimeter camera, because there wasn't anything that was really available at that time, and saw that it would work. I could actually get pictures with when the motion detector detected an animal moving by, it took a picture, but it wasn't small and easy enough to put out in large numbers. 35 millimeter cameras were expensive. And so I ended up finding a small Olympus Infinity camera that you could turn on and leave it on for a month, and it would still take a picture after a month and the battery wouldn't die. So I hooked that up to the Radio Shack burglar alarm, built a modified ammo can, 50 caliber ammo can to put all that in, hooked it up to a 12 volt lawn and garden battery. And basically the whole system weighed 25 pounds, but I built them primarily for the South Fork Grizzly Bear project that started in the late 80s, because I showed that it could work, and built 43 of those camera systems for that project. And there was so much interest in it, I actually sold them to like Hornacher. He was using them on tigers in Siberia, and other, people were using them for pine marten and bears and wolves and stuff like that. That's how I got started in building the remote cameras.
Wow.
And they were some of the first ones that were being used to be able to photograph wildlife without anybody being there. And now it's taken off. Everybody in the world's building digital remote cameras now.
There's going to be some royalties for you somewhere on that. I mean, you pioneered something that is everywhere today.
My wife said you should have patented it.
She's not wrong.
All they really had to do is change a small component so it wasn't the exact same system. Yeah. And then when everything went digital, that changed the whole world.
Pick your poison. You can spend your career dealing with patent trolls or with grizzly bears.
Yeah, I think grizzly bears are easy to deal with.
Yeah.
But it proved very effective. We used them to come up with some population estimates in the South Fork of the Flathead for grizzly bears.
And before that, you were probably just having to collect scat or hair samples and try to make almost educated guesses at populations, I guess. And I guess as DNA sampling has evolved too, it's made it easier to actually get a much more accurate picture of what the population looks like. Is that fair to say?
I would say, yeah, that's fair to say. When we were started, on the cabinet project and the South Fork Grizzly project, it was basically a mark recapture. We would trap a bear. We'd put on big ear tags. Basically, they were like 3 inches long that you could see from a distance. And then we tried to recapture those either visually or with the cameras in the South Fork. And hair samples and DNA wasn't available at that time. And so we were just doing a basic mark recapture, capture bears, mark them, and then see how many of those marked versus unmarked that we could see with the cameras or through, flights and that kind of stuff. And since then, it's really evolved. In fact, 1998, Kate Kendall with the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey. She was working out of Glacier at the time. She's worked on grizzlies for a long time. She came up with working with a lab in Canada, actually first started in Idaho, collecting grizzly bear hairs, getting DNA from it so we could identify individuals. And then in 2004, there was a big DNA project in the whole Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which included, it's about 9 million acres, included Glacier Park in that area. And Kate, with the other agencies, she came up with a population estimate of 765 grizzly bears in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, plus or minus. And then that was basically from DNA, collecting DNA hair samples. So the population estimate stuff has changed over the years. And then since 2004, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the other agencies, we started a trend monitoring program. Rick Mace headed that up. Cecily Costello is running that right now. And basically that was radial collaring thing where they try to maintain at least 20 to 25 radial collared grizzly bears in the ecosystem and monitor their survival rates and cub production and all that. And that's how the population trend is being monitored now.
What does that trend look like now? What do you think we look like numbers wise?
And also, why is it important that we get a good census of these things?
Long story, but I'll try to summarize it. When the Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan was first developed, Chris Servine, who's now retired, Fish and Wildlife Service, worked with and developed first Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan. And that did not have a population number associated with it. It was different criteria. It was female mortality, distribution of females with cubs, various different variables that were used that determined whether the population was healthy or not. People kept saying, well, what's the number? What's the number? What's the number? And so that's why Kate Kendall came up with this hair snagging to get a population estimate that was statistically defendable. And that was the 765 plus or minus with confidence intervals on it. And so once a number came up, people were like, well, how many do we need to have to maintain the population? So that's why Fish, Wildlife, and Parks started the trend monitoring project to see whether the population was increasing, decreasing, or staying stable. And basically, it's been increasing at a rate of about 2 to 3% a year. And so we're up over 1,000 grizzly bears now in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And so people are saying, well, is that enough? Enough bears to delist? And so the whole thing now is, what do we need to delist grizzly bears? And basically, the state is saying, well, we need to have at least 800 grizzly bears in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. We think that's enough. Other people saying, well, no, we need more grizzly bears. We need connection between the different ecosystems, like between Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and the Yellowstone ecosystem. And then you have different recovery areas. You have the Cabinet Selkirks, you have the Bitterroots, you have the North Cascades. And, in more recent, Fish, Wildlife, and Park, or Fish and Wildlife Service came out with a new recovery modification, but basically said we need to have a connected population of grizzly bears in all those ecosystems. Some people are saying the goalpost keeps moving. Other people are saying we've got enough grizzly bears, we can delist the Northern Continental Divide, we can delist the Yellowstone. And so, there's still conversations going on about, what needs to be connectivity, population numbers to get to delisting. So that's kind of where we're at. Coming up with a population number, Yellowstone started doing the same thing. They've been studying bears down the Yellowstone ecosystem for a long time.
What's that number look like?
It was for a while, it was around 800. It started down like 200 and some, and it's up around 800, maybe 1,000 now. Unfortunately, with retirements and some of the present funding levels and the shutting of government offices, Frank Van Manen retired just recently. He was the leader of the Yellowstone Grizzly Bear Study Team, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. Mark Harrelson, he just retired. So basically, that program is winding down. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. Up here in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, there's still the trend monitoring program going on. And of course, the discussions about whether this ecosystem should be delisted, Yellowstone delisted, or wait until we delist the whole grizzly bear population in the lower 48.
But to be clear, those two populations are not yet linked, right? We don't see a sharing of genetic material between those two populations.
Well, those two populations are not linked, correct? But the governor and the state legislature said, well, let's go ahead and genetically enhance that, the Yellowstone population. So last year they caught 2 grizzly bears, one male, one female, in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and took them down and released them in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And then basically the politicians said, well, that's good enough. Now we have genetic diversity. Yeah. We've introduced bears from
to be clear, the politicians, not the scientists. Right.
Yeah. Correct. Yep. The scientists, did what they were told, basically made the move, moved the bears, and the politicians said, oh, that worked. That's good. Now we've got genetic diversity down there. We'll keep moving a few bears every so often, and everything will be good.
And that meanwhile allows us to ignore the issues of habitat connectivity. Not it's not just the species connectivity, but the habitat that allows those two to connect, which is, I think, a larger question about that we sort of have stepped past. We keep talking about listing and all that. What we're talking about is the Endangered Species Act and how that applies not just to grizzly bears, but other wildlife populations. And whether they fall in a category called threatened or a category called endangered, and what that means legally. Mm-hmm. How did that inform your work as a state employee, not a federal? You were a state employee, not a federal employee, but obviously you had interactions then with the federal, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and maybe you could help our audience understand a little more about what that meant in your day-to-day work, because you were working specifically on an animal that was listed on the Endangered Species Act.
Right. And in the lower 48 states, grizzly bears are listed under the Endangered Species Act, but as a threatened species, not as an endangered species. So a little more flexibility there. But as a state employee, I had to get a permit from Fish and Wildlife Service to trap, harm, and harass grizzly bears. I had to get an annual permit to be able to do that. And in order to do that, I had to basically summarize what I had done the previous year. So I would get a permit, and the other bear managers would get a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we basically had it set up that if I got a phone call, grizzly bear was causing a conflict, I would go out, deal with the landowner, see what was going on, see if we could prevent the bear from getting into further conflict, whether it was garbage, chickens, put up electric fence, that kind of stuff. If I decided the bear needed to be captured and relocated or removed, I would go ahead, set the trap. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks would contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the grizzly bear recovery coordinator. We would talk about what the situation was, what the bear was that we caught, male, female, family group, and make a decision as to what to do. As a state employee, I needed to get permission from the state, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, but also from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get permission to relocate that bear, to remove it lethally, or to send it to a facility like a zoo or something like that.
Was that an arduous process? Was it difficult? Or did you find it easy to work in that system?
I found it very easy. Over the years, I had over 600 captures on grizzly bears. And so over that time period, there was only 1 or 2 times I can think of in a management situation where there was some disagreement. Basically, being the person on the ground, knowing what was going on, knowing the bear, knowing the situation, they usually would defer to my recommendation. So I found it quite easy. It was basically a couple of phone calls. Unfortunately, it usually happened in the middle of the night, or it happened on weekends. It was kind of hard to track people down at times because, once we decided and got permission from the Fish and Wildlife Service, I needed to then contact land management agencies, Forest Service, or state lands, or private landowner. And so, we, working with like the Flathead National Forest, we had gone through and worked with the biologists and the district rangers to come up with approved release sites where we could relocate or translocate management bears. And those were remote sites for the most part, but sites that we could get a vehicle to with a trap to release the bear. We did have some sites early on that were approved for within the Bob Marshall Wilderness or the Great Bear Wilderness, but I never used those. And the reason I never used them was, for one thing, we would have had to use a helicopter, which we tried to minimize any helicopter use in designated wilderness areas. The other was it's expensive and it's more dangerous to deal with that, to, use a helicopter to take a bear that's in a net or in a culvert trap and lower it into a wilderness area. And then you got to open the door, you got to release the bear, get the trap back out, the whole bit. And wilderness areas, even though they seem large to people, a bear can walk out of them in a day. And so, it's like, okay, so why go to all this expense and effort and fly them into the middle of the Bob Marshall and have the bear walk out in a day back into the Swan Valley? And so I said, let's just use sites that I can get a vehicle to. And that's what we ended up doing. We could get close, go up Spotted Bear River and get close to the wilderness boundary, but we were actually outside the wilderness on those release sites. So in terms of working with Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service and state lands, for me, it was not a big issue. We had good working relationships, and I thought things went pretty smooth. Even though they were federally listed species, most of the work was done by the state. The state is who hired the grizzly bear conflict specialist. So, Mike Madel was the first one out of Shoto. I was the second one. Third one was Kevin Fry out of Bozeman area for the Yellowstone. And then they hired Jamie Jonkel. He handled the Missoula area in the south end of the NCDE, Northern Continental Divide. And then Kim Annis was hired to work over at Libby. And so she handled the Cabinet Yaak area. And then they ended up hiring a couple others that filled in some of the other areas in between. But the state basically was doing on-the-ground management. Yeah. And then you did have also U.S. Wildlife Services under Department of Agriculture, and they dealt with conflicts with livestock owners, grizzlies killing cattle or sheep. We had a memorandum of understanding that if livestock was killed, we would do a joint investigation. I would go with Fish and Wildlife Service. They would do the trapping most of the time. If a bear was caught, then we would be called in to do the drugging, the handling, the radio collaring, and the follow-up in terms of whether it was released or not. So those are the different agencies that were involved.
The idea of getting a permit before you harm or harass something is, I think I'm going to start making Bill get one of those before he harms and harasses me.
I'd have to get a permit on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. And I'm the one that issues it. Tim, I want to ask, and maybe this question's going to be too long, but I'm going to give it a shot. Because wildfire is a greater and greater threat in our lives, listeners are already familiar, I think, with the WUI, or the wildland-urban interface, a physical space where human development meets wildland vegetation, and the risk of wildfires is greatest to humans. I know you've done a lot of work in the WUI, but your career, as you've been talking about, has also dealt with the human-wildlife interface. And you've just been talking about sort of the grizzly side of that interface. But as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. And it feels like at the heart of that interface is the fact that humans need to consider adverse ways we might be making conflicts worse. Do you think we're facing up to that fact enough? Is that something we're thinking about enough?
No, that's a good point. I actually see a lot of the time grizzly bear management is more people management. Yeah. And even though, the area that I worked in, Northwest Montana, has a lot of public land. There's the NCDE is 9 million acres. 1 million of that's Glacier Park. 1 million plus is the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. A lot of it is, the rest is a lot of it's Forest Service property, but also private property. And I would say over 90% of the grizzly bear human conflicts I dealt with was on private lands. So I spent a lot of time dealing with grizzly bears that were on private lands and on the fringe of or outside the grizzly bear recovery zone. So much of what I did was dealing with private landowners on that urban wildlife interface. That's one reason that I actually switched from research into management, is because our research bears that we were catching in the Swan, where they were dying, was when they came down into that wildlife interface. Everybody used to think, well, grizzly bears live in the middle of the wilderness. They don't come down around people. We have grizzly bears that have gone basically through Big Fork and What Eat Fish and Columbia Falls. And most of the bears that I've caught over the years for human-bear conflicts have been in those urban wildlife interfaces. And because they're coming down because of the food attractants. And, we worked a lot with prevention, garbage. Bears love chickens. Everybody started raising chickens. It's going to be interesting now with the price of eggs. Everybody's going to get chickens, and we're going to have more bears coming down, getting into everything likes to eat chickens, and including people. And bears are very good at finding and killing chickens. But we know that electric fences work really well on keeping bears from getting into certain things. And so a lot of what we did was working with landowners to come up with ways to prevent conflicts from happening in the first place.
It's such a flex. No matter what question Tim is answering, he can say something like, many of the grizzlies I've captured.
We heard it's in the hundreds, right? So we talked earlier about you pioneering the technology of the game, the modern game camera. But recently, I got to hear you talk about just the evolution of technology that you get to use in that grizzly bear management, and how it's allowed you to be proactive instead of reactive to those human bear conflicts. Can you talk a little bit about GIS fencing? Like, it's hard, I know it's going to be hard to describe in a non-visual format that we have here, but like the technology has evolved to the point where you can see where there's about to be a conflict and go work with landowners and the community on how to resolve it. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I've been involved long enough that I could see a big change in technology, and the improvements in technology has definitely helped in wildlife management and wildlife research. I mentioned in '84 when I started working on the Cabinet Grizzly Bear Project, when I walked into the basement at the Forest Service office, basically we were building our own radio collars. We would buy the belting, we'd buy the transmitters, and we would basically put dental sealant around them and put these collars together, and they were VHF collars. So basically, we had to go out on the ground or in the air and use a handheld antenna or antenna attached to an airplane strut to find those bears again. It would just put out a radio signal. And so in order to locate these bears, we had to either be on the ground and triangulate on where they were, or we'd have to get in an airplane, fly around the mountains, look for them, and circle in to try to figure out where they were. And then we would go into the field work, the habitat work. So to give you an idea of the advancements, just before I retired, for several years, we'd used these GPS collars. GPS collars were then available that basically we could communicate with the collar through the computer to make some adjustments as to what programs turned on and off. We would get locations downloaded to our computer every other day. And so you mentioned the geofence. And so basically what it also allowed us to do to program into the collar was areas where we wanted to get more locations on a grizzly bear. So I put a geofence around urban areas where people were living, because I wanted to know when a bear came in around houses, what they were doing. So I could get it where I get a location every half hour. When a bear was in the middle of the Bob Marshall, I didn't really care what it was doing in there. I wanted to know it was where it was still alive. So it'd get a location every 6 hours. So it away from people every 6 hours, when it was in around where people were living every half hour. And so our ability to monitor bear movements greatly increased with the use of GPS and these radio collars that we could get, basically, two-way communication downloaded to our computer. I didn't have to get in an airplane or a helicopter anymore and worry about flipping upside down or crashing in the side of a mountain. Even though we had great pilots, that was always a concern. Most biologists get killed in airplane crashes or helicopter crashes. So, that and price of basically paying to go up in a helicopter got pretty expensive. The collars we used were expensive, but basically they saved money. We got anywhere from a location every 6 hours or a location every half hour, compared to maybe 3 or 4 locations a month when we were flying or on the ground. So our ability to monitor the bears really increased. The other nice thing about the collars is because it was two-way communication. We could actually sit at the computer and we could push a button and tell the caller to drop off. So if we felt the caller was maybe getting too close or getting close to losing battery life, we could actually trigger that caller remotely to fall off of the bear, and then we could go in on the ground and pick it up. And so, that technology, before we just had to wait for the cotton spacers that we put on, to rot off, or if a bear got skinny enough in the den in the winter, pull the collar off and slip it off. So anyway, the advancements in technology were really good. And the geofences helped us with, fine-tuning the number of locations that we got.
And it seems like in a modern world, you can almost then apply that to social media to, bears are out, bears are in your neighborhood. Make sure you're bringing in your trash, making sure you're not putting out bird feeders. It seems like almost in real time, not in like an alarmist, hey, there's a bear in your driveway sort of way, but like just in a sort of a way to mitigate proactively having a negative conflict, which can lead to, obviously the death of the bear ultimately. And I mean, I guess at some level, the death of a human being too, but.
Yeah, luckily I never really had any really bad situations. I had a couple of situations where I had to get involved where somebody was injured or killed by a grizzly, but it's so rare. In all those years, I only had one situation where somebody that I had to go in on was actually, a mountain biker that had ran into a grizzly bear, and the bear reacted and unfortunately killed that person. Yeah, it helped us know where grizzly bears were. The thing is, out of 1,000 grizzly bears, say in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, we would only have, between research and management, maybe 60 to 70 grizzly bears radio collared in a year. Everybody thought we had every bear collared, and they always wanted to know where they were, And I said, we only have a handful of grizzly bears compared to the whole population radio collared. So we would let people kind of know if bears were in the area, but we always had to tell them, we only know about a few bears compared to what's out there running around. So you want to be proactive, prevent conflicts from happening, keep your garbage in, use electric fencing, take the bird feeders in, don't leave dog food on the porch, those standard things, pick your fruit when it's ripe, things like that to make sure, people weren't having bears coming into their houses looking for food.
Tim, I want to ask you about wildlife crossings, which listeners may know are stretches of naturalized infrastructure built over or under dangerous sections of road, in which allow animals like mountain lions, wolves, deer, elk, and even grizzly bears to avoid interactions with humans and human-operated vehicles. Reports by insurance companies and even some of the Western states have shown that these things essentially pay for themselves in a period of a few years, and they obviously save lives. The 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law carried with it a $350 million pilot program for grants to be used on animal passage. And they've already dedicated a couple rounds of funding for that to states both in the East and in the West. I guess I'm just looking to you as an expert in the field for your opinion. These things are so expensive. Are they worth it?
In my opinion, they're very worth it. Some of the first ones were done up in Banff National Park, and they were seeing that they were successful. Bears and other wildlife were using them. And over the years, more and more have been done. The Confederated Silly Scoutney Tribe in Montana, down on the Flathead Indian Reservation, just south of where I'm at, there was some reconstruction work done on Highway 93, and they installed a lot of mostly underpasses, but crossing structures. They have one major big crossing structure over the highway, and they put up remote cameras, trail cameras on those to document use, and they are getting used by a lot of different wildlife species, including grizzly bears. And unfortunately, over the years, there's very few areas like that in Montana, in the area that I work in. Most of them, like I said, are on the Flathead Indian Reservation. But I picked up a lot of grizzly bears and other wildlife that get hit on the highways. And case in point, the Swan Highway, which is south of where I live, you can hardly drive down that in the springtime without, having deer run across the road. In fact, we pick up roadkill deer for bait, for trapping, and we had no problem finding enough roadkill deer to use for bait. I could go out and pick up 7 or 8 roadkill deer in a day easily. I think they're very valuable. They're expensive, like you said. They have come up with some designs that are less expensive, but with some of this, you also need fencing to direct wildlife to those crossing structures. And so, there's a lot of cost involved, but I've seen more effort by Montana Highway Department to plan and put in crossing structures. And so The funding is a big source of, their ability to do that. And they also plan things out like 5 years in advance. So it's not like, next year we're going to do this. They have long-term planning and want to make sure the funding's there and all that. But I totally support wildlife crossings.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like it mitigates the risk to human life. Hitting a white-tailed deer is one thing. Hitting a bull elk is another thing. Hitting a grizzly bear is another thing. I mean, and all species, use these crossings. And, a colleague of Anders and I is working on this very issue in the Southern Appalachians. Everybody in the Southern Appalachians are excited to see elk return, but they're starting to move out of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And to do that, they're going to have to cross Interstate 40. And having wildlife crossings there definitely is something. I know it's something that our friends at Glacier 2 Medicine Alliance here in Montana are working on for, the Highway 2 corridor between the park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. And I get to drive the Swan Valley on at least a weekly basis. And I always refer to it as like playing a game of Frogger. It's not if you're going to hit a deer, it's a question of when sometimes, particularly in early morning or late afternoon. One thing inside the Endangered Species Act, a term that we all sort of talk about, but I don't know if the public has a full understanding, and that's the word take. It's been in the news here in Tim and I's corner of the world in Northwest Montana, specifically because a long-awaited agreement with the railway, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, because just like cars hitting wildlife, we have trains in that same corridor, that same Highway 2 corridor, that sort of middle fork of the Flathead corridor. That term take, can you explain what the word take means? It may be obvious to some, but it's not obvious to all.
Sure. It's illegal to basically take grizzly bears unless you have some kind of permit. And take can take the form of lethally killing a bear, hitting it on the railroad tracks, or harm and harass. That's part of take also. In terms of Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the railroad, I dealt with them when I first started in the conflict position in 93, because they had that huge grain spill in the late 80s up in the Middle Fork, south end of Glacier Park. Grizzly bears coming in, getting hit and killed on the railroad tracks because they were grain cars that had spilled, and there was corn and that was spilled all over the ground. 100 cars tipped over, corn spilled. Burlington Northern basically made some effort to clean it up, but buried a lot of it. And bears came in and fed on it. And 1 year, 8 grizzlies got hit and killed on the tracks. And so they were in violation of take, basically, having bears killed on the railroad tracks. So
they were not doing enough to stop the killing of a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. Yeah,
correct. Yep. And so because of that, some groups threatened to sue them. Basically said, you need to clean this up or we're going to sue you. So they went ahead and spent a lot of money cleaning it up. Took several years, quite a bit of effort, a lot of money. I was up there helping monitor, put up cameras, the whole bit, to see how effective it was. Since then, we've developed a pretty good working relationship with the railroad. And basically, to minimize take along the tracks, they did a lot of different things, changed their mode of operations. They got rid of the old tracks they used to have and replaced the wood ties with concrete ties, used welded ribbon track, so they didn't have the breaks in the track that they used to have. They working with their engineers and their train crews in terms of, knowing how to drive the trains through that steep, curvy section. When corn would spill out of the trains, they would go in and clean it up. If deer and elk got hit on the tracks during the winter, they would remove those carcasses, anything they could do to reduce the chance of hitting grizzly bears, which would be in violation of take. And the habitat conservation plan that you talked about, they started developing that like 20 plus years ago. Finally, it got approved and signed just recently. And so money from BNSF will go towards trying to reduce human bear conflicts within that corridor and other places in Montana. And that was a long term, took a long time to get that all settled.
A short summary of that, I guess, tell me if this is correct, is there's still going to be some take. There's still going to be trains hitting grizzly bears, but they are now going to help fund the larger effort to protect the habitat and protect the population of grizzly bears.
Yes, and because of that, Fish and Wildlife Service has given them a take permit that they're allowed to, like you said, they're going to hit grizzly bears on the tracks. and they're allowed a certain number per year. And if that is exceeded, then things are revisited in terms of whether they're in violation. So, yeah, that basically gives them a permit to take grizzly bears.
Well, I think, this has been such a great conversation. We could go on quite a bit. I'm curious, Tim, as we start to think about wrapping up this conversation, for those who are listening, resources that you can think of that folks could go to better understand the species that you were focused on for your career. If I get this right, it is Ursus arctos horrilibus. Is that pronouncing it correctly?
Sure. Sounds good. Close enough.
I think it's one of my favorite scientific names ever. But where can they find information about the species? We'll provide links in our show notes about the Endangered Species Act. There are some books that I've enjoyed getting to know the species and getting to know the work around the Endangered Species Act. Doug Chadwick's book, Four-Fifths of Grizzly. Rob Cheney, the journalist out of Missoula, his book, The Grizzly and the Driveway. Grizzly Years, Doug Peacock's book. But are there other resources that people should think about looking into, Tim? And if you can't think of it now and want to get me a note on that later, we can add them to the show notes. But curious where you think people ought to look at doing some research.
Sure. There's a couple of websites that I'd recommend. They're agency websites. One is the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, the IGBC website. It's all the agencies that are involved with grizzly bear management in the lower 48. And they have a website that has links to delisting grizzly bear populations, all of that. And so it's igbc.org, I believe, is the site for it. We can confirm that. But Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, somebody searches on that. The other is Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks does have a section on grizzly bear research where you can find the reports, and then grizzly bear management and conflict you can find, and also information on how to prevent human-bear conflicts. There's also other nonprofit sites like Defenders of Wildlife. They do a lot of funding of our help with electric fencing and stuff. There's People and Carnivores is another site. They're very active in terms of prevention of conflicts. They're a nonprofit organization. And Vital Ground also does a lot of habitat work. And so I'd recommend checking them out also. And then in terms of books, you mentioned a couple of them. Doug Chadwick also did a book called True Grizz. And basically, he went out in the field with us for quite a few months and wrote a book about our work back from basically, I think it was mostly the years of 98, that time period, but followed us in the field and basically followed what we were doing, followed certain bears and what happened to those bears and the work that we did with them. So that's one that I would recommend. And, Doug Chadwick, like you said, has written quite a few different books, Four-Fifths of Grizzly, the Gobi Grizzlies. So those are some books that I'd recommend people check out. And I can also, recommend some others that you can put on links.
Tim, those are great recommendations. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate so much the time you've spent with us today. You've invented high-tech monitoring solutions and trapped hundreds of grizzly bears. You're MacGyver and Hugh Glass rolled into one person. But most importantly, unlike Bill, you've never harmed or harassed me. And so I'll always be a fan.
But there will now be a permit. There will be a permit for harming and harassing Anders from now on. Our guest today has been Tim Manley. He is a retired grizzly bear management specialist from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. It's our first guest I've got to interview who's quite literally my neighbor. We talk a lot about dead deer on the highway. I think between Tim and I on any given minute, there's about 12 of them, but that means we get to see a lot of bald eagles too. So Tim, thanks for coming on. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it, and good luck with your podcast.
Thanks, Tim.
The Wild Idea is a production of Wild Idea Media and hosted by Bill Hodge and Anders Reynolds. Production and editing by Bren Russell at Podlad. Digital support by Holly Wilkaszewski at Daypack Digital. Our theme music, Spring Hill Jack, is from Railroad Earth and was composed by John Skehan. Our executive producer and ringleader is Laura Hodge. You can find The Wild Idea wherever you listen to or download your favorite podcast. If you have a minute, please take a minute to give us a rating. And if you really like us, we hope you'll subscribe. Learn more about us at thewildidea.com.